In the afterglow of victory, George Bush is now the most popular president since World War II, approved of by 9 out of every 10 Americans, and acclaimed by Congress.
As Commander-in-Chief, I can report to you our armed forces fought with honor and valor. And as President, I can report to the nation, aggression is defeated, the war is over.
Whilst Republicans basked in reflected glory, the Democrats, anxious not to be left out in the cold, were almost as enthusiastic, with a few exceptions. As Secretary of State James Baker prepared to depart for the Middle East, President Bush said stability there must now be based on the principle of territory for peace, with a secure Israel and political rights for Palestinians.
Anything else would fail the twin tests of fairness and security. The time has come to put an end to Arab-Israeli conflict.
But even before he left, Mr. Baker was warning against expecting any early breakthrough. Democrats hope to exploit President Bush's domestic policy, on which he said surprisingly little last night, as their last hope before next year's presidential election. But such is Mr. Bush's current standing that Democrats hesitate yet to deliver the mildest criticism. House Speaker Foley preaching compromise and cooperation.
We welcome and are enthused about the president's focus on the domestic side of our nation's problems, and we're going to cooperate with him to find solutions.
And the president's closest advisers brush off suggestions that Mr. Bush's policies on crime and education, transport and the economy are nothing new.
There's nothing new about the principle that aggression ought to not stand and countries ought to be free. Those basic principles worked in the Gulf. The newness of recognizing the vitality of this economy and promoting growth and opportunity, it may be an old principle, but there are new ways of doing it.
Out for his regular jog this morning, George Bush looked politically invincible. No leading Democrat has yet put his name forward for the presidential race, and the current view is that, barring disasters, George Bush should win again next year at a canter. Mike Smart, BBC News, Washington.
American Secretary of State James Baker has now left for that tour of the Middle East. He'll be trying to see how President Bush's vision of peace between Israel and her Arab neighbors can be put into practice. But it won't be easy. Israel has already said it won't exchange land for peace.
Mr. Baker set off this afternoon to square the circle. He must meet Arab expectations for a settlement of the Palestinian problem and still show gratitude to Israel for sitting out the war despite Scud attacks on its cities. The signs are that the United States will not be as grateful as Israel would wish, but Mr. Baker, as the envoy of a victorious president, cannot be ignored.
We hope to talk it over with Secretary Baker when he comes here, and to be able to patch up any of the difficulties or differences that we may have.
Already in Jerusalem is a delegation from the European community. They saw the Prime Minister, Mr. Shamir, as part of a drumroll of diplomacy, which will continue to beat down on the Israelis, urging them to address the problems of the Middle East now, when there's a chance of changing positions leading to a solution. But the Foreign Minister, who met them earlier, warned them not to push too hard.
Anything which is perceived in this area as pressure on Israel or as a measure designed to weaken Israel will drive peace away.
The Europeans also met Palestinians. One of the thorniest problems is who should represent them at any talks that can be arranged. Israel won't deal with the PLO. The PLO leadership may be out of favor with some Arab nations, but it's still backed by the Palestinians.
The PLO is part of it, because the Palestinians have to be a part of it, so the PLO will be part of it.
If that's a problem, control of territory is a bigger one. Israel's border police were putting down demonstrations among Palestinians with their customary firmness today. What Washington is urging on them is that they cannot ever be secure if they have to hold down occupied territory. In other words, they must trade land for peace. But the Speaker of the Israeli Parliament, visiting Jewish settlers on the West Bank, rejected President Bush's ideas.
We like very much his friendship, but we know our problems better. We are living here. We are fighting every day for our land. It's not only for our land, it's also for our existence.
The positions have become encrusted over the years, but the diplomats hope that the shock of the war will have shaken them loose enough for sustained diplomatic pressure to move them.